my Substack, so you know my name is John Wolfsthal. I'm a nuclear geek and have worked on this stuff for about 40 years. I've done a lot of work on Iran. And so as news broke, well, I guess news has been breaking for 5 months that we're going to have a deal. But as news broke yesterday that a deal is going to be signed Friday in Geneva between the United States and Iran, I immediately thought about who do I want to talk to about this? And two of my friends that happen to know a lot about Iran and nuclear issues were available. And so I'm thrilled that Joe Cirincione, who's a dear friend, and Arian Tabatabai, who's also a dear friend, agreed to join us this morning. Hi, guys.
Good morning, John.
Hi, John and Joe.
So for those of you who don't know and have been living under a rock, Joe Cirincione is the vice chair for the Center of International Policy in Washington. He is a very accomplished, incredibly well-known, and very well-respected national security expert, formerly president of the Plowshares Fund, formerly the head of the Carnegie Endowment's Nonproliferation Project, where he was my boss. And Arian Tabatabai is the, I had to look this up, you're the vice president, so congratulations. As my in-laws would say, why not the president? Vice president for research, security and defense at the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. She's formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and a former Navy officer and a PhD from King's College. So we got a couple of slouches today to talk about Iran and talk about, quote unquote, the deal. But I'll lead with this. We are three people that were supportive of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We are three people who have been very skeptical and very critical of the current administration's approach towards the entire nuclear issue with Iran. And now we're going to be asked, what do we think about what's been achieved? And I'm trying to be objective about this, right? We're going to talk about whether this deal is as good as what we had before. We know it isn't, but there are a couple of basic questions. And so, Joe, I want to start with you. What do we think is coming out of this deal? Where are we going to be on Friday? Can you just describe what you've heard and what you understand to be the situation?
Right. This is not a nuclear deal. This is not a peace deal. This is not going to settle all family matters. This is just a memorandum of understanding. My understanding is it's fairly brief, maybe 1 or 2 pages. No details have been released, which is somewhat concerning that we don't know yet what the countries are about to agree to. And what it will basically do is 2 things. One, extend the existing ceasefire for another 60 days, during which period the 2 sides, and only 2 sides, Israel's not, even though they're a partner in the war, they're not a partner for the deal. Those 2 sides will then negotiate the other issues, most prominently the disposition of Iran's nuclear program and its future going forward. And most importantly, from the world's economy's point of view, is that it'll reopen the Straits of Hormuz, and that will start the process of reopening 20% of the world's oil and natural gas supply. That's all this is. And whether there's ever a nuclear agreement, we don't know. 60 days is a very short time to try to replicate what it took the Obama team months and months of work to do. This Trump team has proven itself to be remarkably incompetent, so it's not clear they're even up for the task. But that's what lays ahead of us. It's not the end of this conflict; it's the end of the fighting over this conflict and the restoration of the pre-war status quo, minus, because, as we'll discuss, Iran comes out in a much stronger position from this war than the U.S. does.
So, Arian, that's a great segue, Joe. Thank you, because I didn't pay you or we didn't plan this out. So, I mean, one, is there anything you want to add to what Joe understands about what this deal is? And then how do you assess where we are today or where we're going to be Friday compared with where we were when the United States and Israel launched the war in February?
Yeah, I can't find much I disagree with what Joe just said. I agree that this is basically, it looks like an interim deal that is really a stepping stone toward the next thing. That's not what they're calling it. They're calling it a memorandum of understanding or a peace deal. it's an interim deal, right? So that's number one. Number two, as Joe said, we don't know a whole lot about this, which is very problematic, as you will recall, both of you will recall very well. But John, you dealt with this on the inside. In the lead up to the interim deal, that was the stepping stone toward the JCPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, that was signed in 2013, there was a lot of information that we had about what that deal was going to look like. And the fact that we don't really know what this is, what the contours are, other than the administration saying, don't pay attention to what the Iranians are saying, that is not accurate, is raises questions. So then that brings us to the other piece, which is that a lot of what we know about this deal comes from the Iranian side. And that is very problematic, right? Like the Iranian news outlets that are putting out what they claim are deals are not particularly trustworthy. The challenge is, and I think, John, you maybe said something to this effect on your Blue Sky recently, the fact that the White House is also not a source of information is a really deeply troubling place, because typically, or, you know, in any negotiations, you would have both sides putting out information, but we would be able to tell that the White House's account is, we could trust it, right? And we can't trust the accounts that are coming out of this White House, and that is deeply problematic. The second piece I want to kind of agree with Joe on is that this is, you know, people keep talking about we're going back to status quo ante. I don't think that's actually accurate. We're going back to status quo ante minus is a really good way of putting it. And the reason for it is this, is that now Iran, through the course of several months of conflict, has tested its doctrine that it had been developing for years and years, precisely to be able to fight a superior adversary, the United States. It had been putting in place this doctrine that would allow it to close the Strait of Hormuz, which it has now done in a much more nuanced way than we thought it was going to do. Although, and I want to be very specific about this, the administration and the president keep saying, we didn't know they were going to do this. We knew they were going to do this. We didn't know how they were going to do it in the level of kind of tailored manner that they've done it in. And so they've now tested that premise as well. The third thing is, at least from the contours of the deal, what this interim deal is doing is that it is allowing for Iran to just say, okay, we're going to stop shooting at boats and ships as they go through the strait. But we are going to agree to not, you know, essentially to abiding by the NPT, which, okay, they should be doing that. They're a member to the NPT. We can talk about this later. That is not exactly a gain from the US perspective. But they're also able to kind of walk out of this, as far as we understand it, without making any concessions on their missile program, on their support for proxies, and so on and so forth. The United States and Israel are more divided today than they were 5 months ago, which I don't think was something that the Israelis had planned for. We can talk about this as well. So, you know, the administration will say, but we've been degrading and destroying their capabilities on the nuclear front, on the missile and proxies front. Sure, we've degraded some capabilities. I think there is some skepticism here to be had, though, right? Like, they can always rebuild, and I think they will rebuild elements of these capabilities. And that is not a long-term win. That is a short-term win. It is an operational success, but it is not a strategic success. And I think the administration is just not making that distinction between those two things. So overall, I think where we are now is back in January, but a bit worse off than we were back in January.
Let me add one just thing, and I think we've fallen into the trap the administration has set for us, which is to define the terms. What are we talking about when we talk about the deal? And there's one thing they don't want to talk about, and we left it out. Money is going to change hands here. There are billions of dollars that are going to flow to the Iranian regime as a result of just this, just the memorandum of understanding. In other words, we are going to pay them to get back to the spot we were in before we started this war, and it's going to be tens of billions of dollars.
So I've seen those reports, and I believe the Iranians to be better negotiators than the Trump administration. So I suspected that is true, but I haven't seen those terms yet. So it's not clear how that's actually going to happen.
Right.
It's also not clear, if you remember, you of course remember, Iran closed the straits. And then Trump said, I'm closing the straits, right? I joked yesterday, it's like, I broke up with her right after she dumped me. And so, but now with the straits reopening, my assumption is Iran will be able to begin exporting oil through their
Yeah.
tanker fleet, and they will get revenue. And the United States is not in a position to effectively constrain or impose sanctions on that money. So even if the US doesn't hand over large amounts of money or make Iranian assets available, Iran money is going to flow to Iran. Now, to be fair, money was going to flow to Iran under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We were going to release Iranian assets, but we also had allies in place that were going to work with us to make sure that that didn't flow to missile production, centrifuge production. It wasn't going to flow to proxies, right? We had a good understanding that there were massive debts Iran had to pay, and a lot of that money was never actually going to get to Iran. It was just going to go to settle the old accounts. I don't know that we have the same insight in how that money is going to be spent. But again, that's a big gap I think we have to be looking for. Let me just turn things for a second before we get to sort of, how do we judge this deal, whatever the contours might be. If I were to empower either of you to sit down as part of the U.S. team or advise the U.S. team, what would be your near-term priorities, right? You're going to, Kushner and God help them, Witkoff are going to sit down with the Iranian negotiators on Saturday or whenever they say, and okay, here's what we want, right? These are the near-term things we need to get to address our security concerns. What are you going in with? What are the priorities? Arian, I want to start with you. Like, what's your top priority to get out of the Iranians from the 60-day ticking negotiation?
Well, the current situation is a bit of a mess. So I think, my priorities now would be kind of different from what my priorities might have looked like a few months ago. I think the fact that the shooting is stopping is a good thing for the United States, for the Iranian people, for people in the region. So that is a fine thing to have as a top priority. But then you need to have some sort of understanding on the nuclear issue, or else we're going to be back where we are and where we were in a few weeks or in a few months, right? The fact that they're kicking the nuclear can down the road is really troublesome to me, and to me does not make for a sustainable approach here. And there's a few things that should be going into this. We can obviously talk about a lot of it. One is that you have the highly enriched uranium stocks that are still in Iran, right? So that should obviously be an area of priority. The second is would be actually getting access to the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to be able to go in and tell us what is happening, right? Because right now what we're seeing is a lot of hand waving of, well, the HEU is under a ton of rubble and it's not really usable and their facilities have been damaged and destroyed. Okay, but what does it actually look like? We don't have a ton of information about this, and that to me is really troubling. And I hope that on the inside, our intel folks have a clearer picture than we do. They certainly have at least some better understanding of it, but I imagine it's not 100%, right? And I would like to have that information through the IAEA and have some sort of resolution on the HEU itself. Those are the two big things to me that would really need to go into this. But I do want to add a third thing, which is that, I mentioned the proxies and the missiles. Critics of the JCPOA, as you will both remember very well, were adamant that no nuclear deal with Iran was going to be good enough if it did not include the missile piece, because delivery vehicles, right? And I think on some level they weren't entirely wrong that was a gap that we did not address in the JCPOA. We can debate the reasons why and so on and so forth. That's fine. But today, if we're going to accept a deal several years later with a much more advanced Iranian nuclear program that does not include the missiles, I am just confused as to why no one seems to be caring about that suddenly. And they did 10 years ago. So there is kind of, instead of the JCPOA plus that folks had been advocating for, I think we're getting a JPOA minus at this point.
Joe, same priorities, different things, other things you would add to your negotiating list?
If I was to advise the Trump administration, my first priority would be to tell them to call Wendy Sherman and Ernie Moniz and Rob Malley, the people who negotiated the 2013, 2014, 2015 deal, because they're going to need them. Because Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are just not up for this. I mean, never underestimate the profound incompetence of this team. I don't think they're going to be capable of negotiating anything close to the JCPOA. But in terms of priorities, there's really three things you're looking for if you're concerned about stopping Iran from getting a bomb. And remember, this is not what's going to happen Friday. This is what's supposed to happen over the next 60 days. So the first thing is you want to stop their near-term capability. Well, you do that by getting rid of the stockpile of highly enriched uranium gas, and stretching that breakout point to how long it would take them to construct the material for the core of a bomb, stretch that as long as possible. It looks like the Iranians are willing to do that, just as they did it under the JCPOA. Same deal. They had 8 tons of enriched uranium at various levels back then. They have 11 tons now. As Ariane says, it's a bigger, more advanced program now because of Trump's pullout. But you want to get rid of that. They were willing to do that before the war. They're willing to do that now. The second thing you want to do is limit their capability for future advancement, building up future stockpiles. Well, it looks like the Iranians are willing to do that. Some closures, perhaps. They've talked about closing 2 of the 3 enrichment facilities that they have. Maybe they'll get some agreement there, but not all of them. But and interestingly, Iran seems to be willing to put something that the JCPOA did not have, which is a pause in enrichment. So just ceasing enrichment opportunities, which maybe they have to do for practical reasons anyway, right? So they're going to do that. How long? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? We don't know. That's going to have to be worked out. And the third thing you want to do is you want to stop them from never getting a bomb. Well, you can't stop them from never getting a bomb, which is why the JCPOA just had a pledge. Iran pledged never to acquire a nuclear weapon, consistent with its other statements and commitments over the years. This deal will do the same thing. It doesn't, so therefore, it does basically exactly the same thing that the JCPOA did that before Trump walked away from it. And at this tremendous cost and this tremendous expenditure of lives and money and crashed hopes of the Iranian people. Remember, they were supposed to take over their government. That was what Trump promised them. None of that has happened. This war was not just illegal and unnecessary, but completely pointless. We end up in a worse position. This will go down, as some of our friends have been saying, as the greatest strategic defeat in U.S. history. Part of that is going to be our failure to improve on the nuclear dimension of the JCPOA, but a whole lot of this is what the war has cost the United States in credibility, in legitimacy, in alliances, all our bases that we developed in the Middle East after 1991. And we didn't used to have bases in the Middle East. Now we do have bases. Those used to be seen as an asset by our Gulf partners. Now they're going to be seen as a liability. The entire calculus is changed here. China benefits from this. Russia benefits from this. Iran benefits from this. Who are the losers? The Persian Gulf states, the Iranian people themselves, who are stuck with a stronger, more entrenched, richer regime than they promised. And of course, the United States suffers a global humiliation. When Trump goes to the G7, he's not going to be recognized as some hero, as the guardian of the Middle East, as he put it yesterday, the guardian of the Middle East. He's going to be seen as a loser who's using this agreement as a fig leaf for his surrender.
So I agree with both of you that the nuclear issue has to be front and center, and Arian in particular. I think the priority number one is we have to get the IAEA back in place. These are the only people that have been on the ground. The Director General, Rafael Grossi, told last week that the IAEA has lost continuity of knowledge over where Iran's uranium is. We lost years ago because of the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. Knowledge about is Iran stockpiling centrifuges? Are they stockpiling the equipment to build centrifuges? So, we need to at least start rebuilding our knowledge base that would supplement and in many ways, I think, probably surpass what U.S. intelligence capabilities can do so that we can throw our arms around the nuclear challenge, right? So remember, Trump claimed, and we don't take this White House at their word, Trump claimed that they would have a bomb by now, right? They were going to have a bomb in weeks. And while they had the capability, we didn't see that sprint. 2 weeks. If that were true, then the same situation is true today. They still have the same material. They still have the same capability. They still have the same knowledge, minus some of the scientists and engineers that have been killed. But that's not been a major impediment. So you've got to throw your arms around that. Then, Joe, I think you put your finger on a really important point, which is we shouldn't discount the possibility that Trump might be able to negotiate a long-term suspension and enrichment in Iran, both because Iran may no longer be able to quickly reestablish its enrichment capability, but getting back to Iran's point, because they may no longer need to have a rapid breakout, right? And I think this is a critical point people miss. And this gets to the strategic defeat. Before the war, Iran was deterred from closing the straits. We were worried about them closing the straits from the 80s when they bought Silkworm missiles, cruise missiles from the Chinese, and put them on the
Right.
strategic points. This is going back 35 years,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We were tracking where they were, where they're going to launch them from, a handful of these missiles. Yes, that's
And
right.
and when we were concerned about the Gulf being closed, Reagan flagged foreign tankers so that if they were attacked, these were American tankers. This was an act of war against the American. Iran backed off, right? That deterrent is gone. Iran no longer fears the United States. They have taken, I won't say the worst blow because we were worried that Trump might actually go nuclear, which would be the most horrific thing. But they took everything we could throw at them and came out looking pretty good. They still have a lot of their missiles. They still have a lot of drones. And the U.S. showed that we don't have the guts to flag foreign tankers anymore. We're not going to war, all-out war, to keep the straits open. So Iran may no longer need the nuclear deterrent in the near term because they have the strait deterrent in the short term, because they still claim them as their own. Trump can say that, well, they're open forever, but Iran has now established its claim over those international waters. And it's not clear to me that the United States is seen as credibly being able to keep them open, at least under this administration. Let me turn for a minute to some other issues, because I want to make sure we can get to them all. Realistically, let's say that Wendy Sherman and Rob Malley and Ernie Moniz are advising the administration, and they really put their best. How long do you think it takes the United States and Iran to negotiate a deal that can then be put before the Congress? Because we're going to get to that in a minute. Remember, even under this administration, there are certain laws that get followed, and eventually this is going to have to get put up for a vote. But let's just talk for a minute. How long do you think these 60-day negotiations are going to take, Joe? I want to put you on the Kalshi betting poly market.
Oh, I would say easily through the end of this year. Through the end of this year, there's no way this is getting done in the summer, in the fall. This is complex stuff, and you got to pay attention to the details, or else you end up with a deal that looks good on paper, but it turns out there's this wiggle room in clause 36 of paragraph 4. So at least the end of the year.
Ariane?
I mean, I think it depends on what kind of deal we're going with, right? If we're going to get an actual no kidding deal that addresses things well and crosses the T's and dots the I's and, and all of those things, then Joe is right. It would take a long time because of just how the nuclear issue itself, as I've been trying to explain to folks, it took, again, as Joe mentioned, the Obama administration about 2 years, right? 3-ish. From soup to nuts, from the Oman negotiations in 2012 to the actual JCPOA. And then there was some buffer, and then the implementation period started, right? So it took several years to get a deal. And then in the Biden administration, we were trying to return to the JCPOA. We negotiated for, I think it was a year and a half-ish, and it didn't go anywhere. But it took a year and a half to basically get the kind of ingredients in place to have a deal that could be defended if it had gone through. So, and that's just on a nuclear. And then you add to that the other issues, missiles, proxies, et cetera.
I think we could agree that that's just not going to be part of the deal, right?
So,
we're not going to see that.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Too complicated. But you raise a good point. Could this be a simpler deal? Well, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I do. It can. I think it can. And I think that's probably where we're going to end up, because look, this is not an administration that is known for being a particularly, this is not the Obama administration, right? Or the Biden administration. They're not trying to get a very thorough deal that basically makes sure that everything is, crossed and dotted and everything. I think that the president is, look, he's bored of this war. He wants to move on. He wants to go to Cuba. He wants to do all these other things. We have midterms coming up. He doesn't want to be sitting there negotiating a 150-page thing that addresses the nuclear issue once and for all. So I think we're probably going to end up seeing something that is shorter, that is more to the point, and probably less, detailed, less thorough, and so less bulletproof. And that can be done pretty quickly.
I'm sure that is true that I know he's bored. I know he wants out. I know he wants to go to Cuba. But there are a couple things that are worth pointing out here. I did some research yesterday. Iran has been saying since 1966 that it would only use nuclear materials and nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. That's when the United States sold its nuclear reactor to Iran in Tehran, which is the research reactor where they used to make medical isotopes, and that sort of threw Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff for a loop because, well, why would you want to keep that? Well, you sold it to us. So it's been 60 years. Iran has been saying, we're not going to build a bomb. Trump, of course, is going to say, all right, well, we have a deal, and they finally have committed that they're not going to build a bomb. So you can put that into a deal pretty quickly. But all of these details about, well, how do we know that there's no enrichment facilities, right? What do you mean you're not going to build a nuclear weapon? Those things have to be settled in some way. You could do that in very general terms, but then the United States is going to have to say, well, wait a second, we saw this. That's not consistent. We're going to X, right? The problem is the United States can no longer X. We cannot sustain the pace of operations of our military in the region the way we have for the last 6 months, in part because they get tired. They have to go home. We're out of missiles. It's expensive. And Trump wants to go and invade Cuba, right? This is why Marco Rubio is along for the ride. He wants to be the guy to get rid of the Castro regime, the same way Trump says, okay, I got rid of the Maduro regime and I got rid of Khamenei, even though the results could be worse. But he wants to pivot there. So that's just one observation I would make. The second here is the JCPOA was possible because there was a global sanctions regime that was in place. And every day that regime was in place, Iran got poorer. They didn't have money to build missiles. They didn't have money to fund their proxies. They didn't have money to actually maintain the operations inside Iran. Every day that this negotiation goes on, Iran gets richer. And they can actually, now the question is, of course, is the United States going to pay the $300 billion in reparations that Iran is asking for to rebuild their country? I think that's unlikely, but they are going to make a really tough negotiating team in the face of the United States that wants a deal desperately. And then that brings us to the I would say maybe not the final point, but the penultimate point, which is whatever gets negotiated is going to be covered under something called INARA. Ariane, would you like to explain to people who have forgotten what INARA is?
I was recently trying to remember what it actually stands for, and honestly, it's been so long that I don't. It's the Iran.
I think it's the Iran Nuclear Review Act. I forget
Review
what the
Act.
A is. Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, there is this requirement that basically any deal would have to be submitted to the Congress, which also, this brings us back to the midterms, right? Are we going to get a deal before there is a potential big change in the Congress or not? Then there is the piece of, well, listen, Democrats tend to kind of roll with whatever deals come their way because, and especially given how unpopular this war has been, well, across the board, including with some Republicans, but especially with Democrats and independents, then they might be willing to kind of rubber stamp whatever deal comes their way to move forward. But I do think that this is somewhere where actually there is going to be a bit of a challenge for the president because there are folks in his base, in his party, who have a long track record of decades in some cases of being extremely opposed, not just to the JCPOA, although it was crystallized really during the JCPOA, but who would be opposed to any deal with Iran. And we started hearing some whispers of that a couple of weeks ago when the first kind of, you mentioned, John, at the beginning, there's been breaking news for weeks now or months now that, we're going to have a deal. So the last time we had breaking news that the deal was going to happen, you had folks like Senator Cruz, and a number of others,
Lindsey
Senator
Graham.
Graham, come out and say, oh, this is not
Yeah.
looking like it's going to be a good deal. So, we know that the war is not particularly popular with some corners of the MAGA movement, but also negotiating with Iran is not particularly popular with a lot of people on the kind of, traditional Republican side of things. So he's probably going to start experiencing some challenges there.
You're on mute, John. John?
Thank you very much. I had lawn care out front, so we're juggling here. It's the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act.
Oh,
so I looked it up in real time. Thank you,
Okay,
Internet.
good.
So Joe, I want to turn to you on this particular point because this really gets into very complicated dynamics and things are shifting quickly, right? When the Obama administration negotiated the JCPOA, we had lovely things like the Congress inviting Prime Minister Netanyahu to give a joint address.
That ain't going to happen this time.
Well, interesting. I wonder whether that only happens when Democrats are in the White House. Apparently, his invitation is not pending. But things are shifting, right? Before, the Democrats were completely in line with the Israeli point of view, and AIPAC was quite active, and this was a real constraint. That shifted in American politics inside the Democratic Party, but the Republicans also are going to have to wrestle with this as well. And then, of course, our friends from the FDD and Mark Dubowitz and the good ISIS, although I don't call them the good ISIS because they're the pain in the ISIS, I want you to talk a little bit about how you think the dynamics might play out here.
Okay.
Remembering, of course, that we in the Obama administration negotiated in a very particular way. You need to get 2/3 opposition to block any deal. So there's a pretty high bar to prevent the president from putting in place. But this agreement is going to get raked over the coals in Congress. And I want you to sort of talk us through what you anticipate that would look like.
If I'm predicting right now, if I were to bet $100, I would say whatever deal they come up with is going to get approved because of the politics, not necessarily about the substance. So remember, Republicans always attack Democrats for being weak on defense. It doesn't matter what kind of deal they come up with, whether it's Law of the Sea or it's a New START or it's the Iran deal, they get attacked by the Republicans. When a Republican negotiates an agreement, Democrats usually support it because Democrats are in favor of diplomatic solutions to these thorny security issues, and the Republicans go along because it's seen as a win for their guy. That's kind of what's going to happen here. So, in other words, the debate over the JCPOA was less about its merits and more about its politics. The Republicans didn't want to give Obama a win, and in this case, they were then helped by Netanyahu, who was the driver of the opposition. If it wasn't for Israel's opposition to the JCPOA, I don't think we would have had a debate on the scale and the intensity that we had. But even in a politically driven debate, you need some substance, and that's where the FTDs come in, or the so-called, Iran proliferation hawks, who are going to raise questions about all this, but that's not going to derail it. That's not going to stop it. It's going to be in. Donald Trump controls the Republican Party. Period. Full stop. He negotiates a deal. The Republican Party is going to approve it. There'll be some outliers, some people positioning, but it'll get done.
Does that change if Democrats win either or both of the houses in November? Because this deal may not get done before the election, and the deal may come up for review in a divided Congress.
Yeah, but even if this is likely a weaker version of the JCPOA, it's better than the alternative, and it provides some limits, and you can always build on it, correct it in the future. So Democrats, I think, will support it, raise a lot of serious questions, try to score political points on Trump's incompetence, his weakness, point out that this is a surrender that we lost, and this was, greatest strategic blunder in U.S. history. All those things, but they will approve the deal.
Okay, Aaron, you think that's true?
I think that's true. I do think there is the Israel piece here, which we should, we've kind of talked a little bit about it, but I think we should actually specifically address the Israel piece because, we've said this, the United States and Israel are increasingly divided in a way that they weren't a few months ago. And I don't think that the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu went into this conflict thinking that they would come out with a more radical Iranian regime that would still be in place and legitimated in some ways legitimized by this administration. and that it would end up being kind of in tension with President Trump, who had historically been viewed by Netanyahu as an ally as opposed to Joe Biden, despite his very strong support after October 7th, or Barack Obama. And so, I think that, we're seeing the kind of division play out a bit more publicly now than we were previously, right? Like there's been F-bombs that have been dropped by apparently by President Trump in conversations with him. So, I think there is still a way for Netanyahu to kind of play some of the role that he did back in 2015. I agree with Joe. It's probably going to be a bit more muted now than it was back then, because I think that, Netanyahu didn't see it as, a top priority to keep Democrats in the fold with him. I think he sees that with Republicans, because right now, if he loses Republicans, he's lost essentially the entire political system in the United States, given how tense the relationship has become with a lot of Democrats. But I think that we're probably going to see some level of activity from Israel, and we're already seeing it, right? Like if one of the items here is going to include a ceasefire in Lebanon as well.
Yes.
And the United States is promising on behalf of Israel to stop its operations in Israel. And Israel has made it clear that they're not going to be doing things on our timeline, and because we are promising to do it. And so there are ways for Netanyahu, I think, to play spoiler, quote unquote, in a way that is not just appearing before before the Congress and saying bad things about the president.
Aaron, you missed your chance to coin a phrase, so I'm going to steal it. The mother of all F-bombs, right? So, it's. So I want to try to bring this to a close here on exactly that point, spoilers, right? So, Israel is going to reserve the right, as it always has, to take military action if they perceive Iran to be a threat. And that could precipitate a breakdown in all of this. So that's one thing I think we can look at. That's, there's a reason Iran might want an underground nuclear facility, because they know that anything that's going to be on the surface is vulnerable. But Joe, I want to sort of ask you, like, what else are you looking for? Things, we would like a permanent ceasefire. We would like Iran not to have nuclear weapons. We would like to see a diplomatic path that leads to resolution of these conflicts. We would like to get rid of proxies and missile threats. But what do you see as the main things that are going to thwart that from happening over the next year?
Yeah. On this Netanyahu issue, our friend Rob Malley has pointed out that one of the reasons Trump is able to do what he's doing is because he's been willing to do something that his predecessors haven't, which is to tell Bibi Netanyahu, enough, stop. And this includes most recently his bombing in Beirut, and that's resulted in the phone calls, etc. Now, whether other presidents could have done that, they didn't. Neither Biden did that, Obama didn't do that. Trump is doing that, and that's a lesson for future presidents. We're the stronger partner in this alliance. You depend on us. It's not the other way around. Second, spoilers. Well, we always have Netanyahu. He's going to try, but I don't think he doesn't have the standing anymore. Israel doesn't have the influence anymore, particularly over a MAGA president. A sheer incompetence that they just could fumble this away, on the 5-yard line. They could do that. Opposition from Saudi Arabia and UAE. Strong. They don't like this either. They kept telling all of us, John, you and I have been in meetings with representatives from those countries who said we have to finish the job. Well, we're not going to finish the job. So they're going to be unhappy, but stop it. No, I think they have concluded this thing has got to come to an end. To turmoil in Iran, a rise up of the Iranian people again, possible, but probably not in the cards. They are deflated. They are defeated. They were promised, and they had a new hope. They were promised a regime change. They said help was on the way. It didn't come. It didn't happen. The Iranian public has less leverage, less abilities now than they did before. I think that's my list. See, when I go through that list, I basically think, the final thing that's going to do it is just the failure of the two sides to actually agree. Iran in these negotiations, unlike the JCPOA, they keep getting stronger, as you pointed out, John. So they're in the superior negotiating position. Trump clearly is trying to get out. He just wants to end this. So the Iranian leverage is going to be enormous, and it may be that they overreach and the whole thing, blows up. So I'd say my last point would be Iranian overreach.
Ariane?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that you can always bank on Iran to screw up something for itself. And, part of it might be because of a system level decision. We've talked already about we have a more radical in some ways, and a much more inexperienced crew here at this point, right? And so they don't know, the previous crew were not exactly the most, savvy and most thoughtful people, but they had through the decades of experience learned what the kind of limitations and guardrails and realities were. And this is not that's not true with the current Iranian leadership. Second,
Right. In part because the U.S. killed them. They
Right.
killed Larijani, right? The guy who's the deal
yes.
maker, who could make the deal. They killed him.
Yes, and this, we could spend hours here talking about what we were thinking and why we decided that this was going to be a better alternative, but that's a separate issue. The second, I think there is a piece where, also you have an Iranian regime that is increasingly controlled by the IRGC, but by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who have their own interests on top of, in some ways they're aligned with the overall system, but they also have a number of interests of their own. And so, I think in a way that was not the case before, you have an increasing chance of them being a spoiler. I don't know that it's the likeliest scenario, but it's probably one that we should consider anyway. And then the next level is proxies, right? You have Iranian proxies, some of which respond directly to Iran, some of which don't. We've had in the past tensions that have resulted because a proxy group decided to shoot a drone at one of our bases. And you could see something like that play out now here again. And look, this is a president who is who's not exactly steady in his approach to things, right? He understatement.
You're a master of understatement.
So he has a tendency to kind of act on what he sees last, what he hears last, and so part of it is also what are the things that are going to happen on the ground in the region. Are they going to be kind of attacked by proxies, for example, that make it look like he doesn't have the situation under his control, and then he decides that he's going to blow up the process? That is also a possibility. But I mean, overall, I agree with all of the actors that Joe mentioned. I will add one caveat to the Iranian people piece, which is that I agree that, they're probably on some level feeling depleted and defeated at this point. But I think the more important thing here is that you have a regime that is, crushing dissent in a way that it's using the war as a cover and as a justification to continue to perpetrate, large-scale human rights abuses. That's being documented by various human rights groups. So, it's not just that they're feeling defeated, it's also that there is a real repression machine that is in place that is keeping them in their place until they can kind of assert control over the situation.
I agree with all of that. Two things I would add is, Joe, we've always been worried that our Gulf partners, when they see the United States weakening, are just going to start cutting deals of their own with Iran. I think we're likely to see that. I'm sure that there's going to be coordination. I still expect the Omanis and the Iranians to work out some sort of deal to provide protection over the straits as long as Trump gets a taste of that. I think we could easily see that. But I think we're also going to see nuclear latency, right? That if whether Iran is actively moving towards a nuclear weapon or not, Saudi Arabia, UAE know that they can no longer trust the United States as their security protector. And so they're going to start looking elsewhere. That might be Russia, that might be China, that might be independent. So I think we have to look at that. There's the other spoiler here, neither of you mentioned. So you get one demerit each. Europe. The European negotiators told me a year ago that we should not underestimate the anger of Europeans towards Iran as they provide Shahed drones to the Russians to carry out and continue to conduct the war in Ukraine. And you do need Europe to lift sanctions. You do need Europe to do banking transactions. You do need Europe to say it's okay to release assets. This was one of the challenges the Obama administration had. We don't hold a lot of Iranian money. It's the Europeans who do. And if you want to get the sanctions lifted, you've got to go through the Europeans. And so they have the ability to play a spoiler here. I don't think they're going to kill a deal, but they're going to ask, like, what are the nuclear terms? How sure are we? What are you doing with the drones? I think that's something we just have to be looking out for. This is exactly what I wanted. I got to talk to two people that are smart, that think a lot about this, that can do it in very clear, articulate terms. And I get to check in with two friends early on a week, which is going to be just like blowing past us. So thank you both very much. I hope you have a fabulous time wherever you are. And if this works, maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Deal. Thank you, John, for having us.
See, we got a deal.
Wasn't that hard?
We have a deal. Yeah.
We have a deal. Whether we can get it past Congress remains to be seen. Okay. Thank you all.
Thanks, John. This was fun.